between everybody here, I mean, we've got like traditional marketing, we've got agency, we've got journalists turned poacher turned gamekeeper kind of things, and we've kind of seen a lot of different things. So what I wanted to do was really spend some time, like, kind of aggressively going off some questions and trying to work out what works for us and what might work for you. You know, I'm lucky enough as well to have sat on both sides. You know, Medium is both I'm not there anymore, but Medium is both a content marketing platform in lots of respects, and also I was doing the company marketing and weird kinds of marketing on there as well. Yeah, weird is always good. So I just, you know, I wanted to start with, honestly, like the most direct and basic question, which is why the fuck should you market this way in the first place, right? Like, what's the argument you make to yourself and to the people, you know, the companies you work for, and the brands that you work with? Like, why do it? You know, what's the value for you and the customer?
Sure. So I come from mostly a social marketing background, and I'm really happy to be at Reddit today because I think in so many ways Reddit delivers on this promise of social media that we've really lost. This idea, you know, early Facebook marketing of you build up an audience of advocates and they are going to spread your message to their friends and to the masses. That largely has gone unfulfilled, and I think Reddit is a place where you know, that viral community of people who are really passionate about something can be activated in a really interesting and unique way. And so I realize that's a little bit of a self-serving answer coming from the Reddit advertising team, but you know, that to me, that connection with the audience and a real dialogue with the people that matter to your business, that's what makes me passionate about it.
How about you, Kelly?
Oh man, I feel like I have to fill my like ever perpetual role of being a contrarian in these sort of things, but like I don't think you should necessarily. Like, I mean, I honestly think if the takeaway that all of you have from this event is like, holy fuck, everyone's doing content, we should do content, then that's the wrong takeaway. Like, so much of this depends on who you are trying to talk with and like what you have to say to them and where they are. Like, you have to start back there before you can decide on doing content marketing in the first place. So, I mean, I honestly think like that is the foundational information that you need to decide if you're going to do this.
Yeah, it's not an answer to every problem.
Yeah,
and
right.
It's specific. And John, I mean,
there's too many people just ticking the box. Let's do content.
Yeah.
Unless you're really bought into it, unless you're going to do it authentically, you're wasting your time. I mean, it's a really great form of marketing in the sense of the more you put into it, the more you'll get out of it. There's a great, Thomas Tunga's the Redpoint VCs did a really, really good article about it. You know, he does these kind of data-driven articles, but he looked at, like, if you do a blog with evergreen content, you know, and actually invest in that over time, unlike other forms of marketing, because it's evergreen content that people will find, evergreen is content that's a bit timeless and people find SEO over time, that actually the more you put in, the more you'll get back, and there's no sort of end in with that. But you can't say that, like, if you're spending money on demand gen or anything like that, the minute you stop spending that money, it's gone. But also there's probably a point where you're just saturate the market. You can't do any more. So it's like a compounding form of compounding return.
Yeah.
But it's just it cuts out a lot of the bullshit. There's no one else to deal with. You're marketing to people. You're like talking to them, saying this is our story, or you know, this is what we think about the world, or whatever it might be. There's every other kind of marketing. There's some, like, it is the direct marketing of today.
For me, one of the questions is like, who are you really trying to reach? Like, what are you really trying to do, and what are you really trying to transmit and create? You know, sometimes it's lead gen, sometimes it's a deeper relationship with the product, sometimes it's brand building, all the different kinds of things. But I wondered, like, how each of you see that in both the roles you're in now versus maybe previous roles. Like, how's that changed? Put your hand up if you want to go first.
I mean, at a very high level, you're like, I worked in media for 20 years before I went into the software business, and you know, like, people are saying, oh, journalism is in a really bad place at the moment, that's why you got out. And I'm like, no, the business of media is in a really bad place. Journalism's never been in a better place. But like, we're all read stuff constantly because we have access to it all the time. So, you know, I think my old job was to sell newspapers, and people say, oh, that's heretical for like a journalist to say, you know, it should be an art and a craft. You know, I think that's half the problem. And I think also with content, people get very carried away with, like, retweets and shares and all these vanity metrics. At the end of the day, you're selling your product. And don't look. People lose sight of that very, very quickly.
Yeah.
Like once your company gets beyond about 5 people, people start like getting notions about like, why you should be doing these things. I mean, it's very simple. If it's not adding to the bottom line. So for us, we've quite an efficient machine now at Intercom in terms of like, we know the things we can do with content that will drive leads, that are at the top of the funnel, that we need to do every quarter, and we deliver a lead target. And a lot of people go to me, oh, it's great, you guys don't really sell through Intercom, like with your content. But we carry a lead number, and we know what things that we can ask people for an email address for, and we also know what things we're going to write that, probably shouldn't if we're just purely thinking about that. But we don't lose sight of the goal. At the end of the day, we have to sell, or someone has to buy Intercom, or else we
and
will
so
be
your
doing what we're doing.
audience is potential customers. Like,
Absolutely.
And how about you, Kelly? I mean, you've been at Slack and GitHub and Bugsnag before that. Like, there's kind of like a mixture of different audiences and different approaches that you might have taken.
Yeah, I mean, it's been so multifaceted, right? So you think about GitHub, I think, had very much 2 types of audiences. So one, on the open source side, like we were talking to developers and we were trying to get them excited about using GitHub to develop code and build really cool projects. And I think the lens there that we took was very human-centric, right? Like if you're building software with other people, how do you do that in the best possible way? Like what is going to inspire you and what is going to teach you to do that? I think a very similar strategy with Bugsnag, right? So for those of you who don't know, it's an exception monitoring tool. And I think the idea there was like, dealing with like a really hairy crash in your application can be really frustrating. So how do you make that a moment that's less stressful and less about panic and more about insight and clarity? And I think some of the best content that worked there was taking, things like jQuery is not defined, right? And helping people understand what that meant. It's like a very common error code, right? But like that's a moment where someone's trying to get educated. And then I think with Slack, we have just a variety of audiences, right? So we ultimately have people that we want to sign up and use Slack, but we also have this whole platform side where we want developers to build third-party applications that everybody in the world who's using Slack can use. So the strategy there, I think, is much more multifaceted depending on who we're talking to.
Yeah, and for you, Joe, I mean, you're kind of sitting on the other side of the table there, right? And you're probably seeing across a range of different clients, different people who are advertising on Reddit or bringing stuff to Reddit. Like, what is it how can they find audiences that they want?
Well, I mean, that's really what our advertising business is here to do. We're the 4th largest site in the US right now. So really any audience that an advertiser is trying to go for, we can find them. The problems are in convincing them that these people are using Reddit in unlikely places. We have a massive number of female makeup enthusiasts, which is an unlikely audience for Reddit. And we also deal with this problem of we have like the best content on the internet. Those Redditors in the audience probably feel that way. I feel that way as like an 8-year Redditor. And our problem is really more, how do we show new people who haven't gone through the gauntlet of learning to use our old school forum looking website, how to access it and to find these communities that are really interesting to them. In the advertising space, a big part of what we do now is we find these people who are real advocates for a brand or for a subject. And we know that on Reddit, the comments really become at least half the value of our platform. And so what we do in those cases where we find these niche audiences that are interested in a brand and who we know that brand can activate in really interesting ways, we want them to start a conversation and to build a conversation. And then once we've got those advocates in there talking already, in the comment thread, even of an ad, we can broadcast that conversation out to the people that we want to influence, those neutral parties. So
that's a really interesting point, because as someone who's looked a lot and talked a lot about what platforms offer people, I wanted to talk a little bit about, there are many platforms out there are many distribution channels. You probably end up, when you're marketing, you probably end up with a suite of many different ones that you put different weights and different bets on. And your job as a platform is to try and sell the reason why you should have a bigger bet than everybody else. And I know, part of that is hustle, part of that's true, part of that's like totally fake, right? It's like, when you talk to someone, you're like, okay, at least 50% of this is complete bollocks, right? And then, but some of it is true, and some of it applies to you in different ways. So I wondered if, like, how do you all think about where you publish, how you distribute? You know, we heard a couple of talks earlier about how those are critical. Like, how do you weigh up the balance of where you market, where you produce? Kelly, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think it just all goes back to who and what you're trying to achieve, right?
So give us some very specific examples of where you produce things and how you try and distribute it.
Yeah, sure. So I think the channels that you have on your own site, right? So a good example would be, if you have a blog on your own property, right? Publishing content there can have a really great knock-on effect of increasing keyword searches and things that people are ultimately like going to go look for other things on, which can then have like a multiplicity of effects around your ability to do like really nice search engine marketing that doesn't feel like spammy and weird and gross. So I think there's that to consider. I think sometimes platforms like Medium, if you're trying to like reach a larger audience, and sort of that decision of like, are you like going to build your own and invest the time to do that versus sort of capitalize on what's already being built is an interesting choice and trade-off. I think something else that we've really been considering, particularly, this is less for content, but more about how do we put Slack in front of people, is like, when are there moments when people might be open to like hearing or reading or seeing something about Slack, right? So, we have a current advertising campaign that's running right now that's really about this idea that if you think about transitional spaces that people are going through, so someone's not at work, they're not at home, they're somewhere commuting between the two, that might be a really interesting time to like reach them with some sort of content or some sort of message about Slack, because perhaps in that moment there's like more receptivity because you're not in the like habitual patterns of home or the habitual patterns at work. So I don't know, I feel like I don't want to feel prescriptive about it and be like, these are the 3 platforms that work, because I think that's total bullshit.
Well, you've also built a platform that totally blurs the distinction between home and work. So
yeah, so it's so aligned, but I think like if anything, like the most important takeaway is that like wherever you distribute and wherever you publish, whatever the thing is you're putting out into the world, it has to feel very authentic for you. And I think that's like, when people don't do that authentically, it's where you get that really fucked up like #brands territory, right? Where you're like, we're irrelevant and we're gonna like put our message over here into the world, and people are like, why are you interjecting yourself into this conversation? So like, I don't know, that like authenticity bar, I think is really critical for you to like have not only great content from like a writing and storytelling perspective, but one that actually like intersects with people and feels like you're taking part of a conversation, not like shouting over them and dominating them and just trying to like rack up stupid engagement metrics for the heck of it.
John, where do you put your hashtag content about your hashtag brand?
Your brand
Actually,
content?
you know what hasn't been successful for us, not to have a go at you, but Slack communities have never been successful for us. People always said, there's all these like great Slack communities you should find. And we're like, that hasn't worked for us. But no, the reason I say that is I wanted him, he would have cut me off if I said this first, but like there's just kind of a way we think about this at Intercom, and I have a couple of colleagues here who are going to groan because it's a bit of a cliche in Intercom at this stage, but one of our co-founders wrote a post, start with a cupcake, which is this idea that if you want to make a wedding cake, you don't start off like doing the icing, then making like a full-size cake, and then assembling the whole thing. You start off with making a cupcake and figure out like the flavors and all that kind of stuff. And we do something similarly with content. We have a really successful podcast. I was really skeptical. I didn't listen to podcasts because I actually cycle on my commute, so I don't get a chance to listen to them. I had small kids. I just didn't listen to podcasts. And I was like, yeah, maybe there's an audience. I don't know. But anyway, we said, let's just like guerrilla do 10 episodes and just see like what works. Like what does an Intercom podcast feel like? I mean, it feels quite like our blog in a lot of ways, but actually it's different in other ways in that it's just conversations. So one of the other things we do is we always try and see things through the lens of our product, and our product is about having conversations with your customers. So it feels right for us, for our podcast, to be more like just a conversation with someone we really admire and want to highlight, rather than say yours, which is much more about work and different aspects of work, and you talk to lots of different people every week and tell different stories. And like that feels like Slack, like there's a lot going on. I mean in a positive way. So that's kind of the way I think about it. Podcast turned out to be really successful for us, and we invested a lot more, double down on it. The funny thing is, any of those recommendations like that, you read on a lot of like growth hacking forums and places in terms of try this and do this. We've cupcaked some of them, try them, relatively little success.
Yep.
You find your own audiences pretty quickly, and you'll know pretty early on. It's not like you have to have keep some really complex scorecard to figure out which ones are working. We started republishing posts on Medium and doing some original content on Medium. That's hugely successful. Facebook's hugely successful. If we want to talk about ourselves, Facebook's a great place to do it because people are fans of you on there. It is actually the place where people have, I'm not fans of that. Think about it. How many companies are you actually a fan of on Facebook?
Absolutely zero.
Well, if you are, if any, you're pretty, you do actually genuinely have a relationship, so you're happy to let them talk about themselves, but you wouldn't talk about yourself on Facebook the same way you talk about in other platforms. So it's really, you just got to feel it out. Don't over-invest in anything till you know it's working.
One thing I've found on sort of both sides of the divide is that you really only get, like, experiments only get you so far, and people expect, if an experiment can get us like 1,000 leads or 100,000 views or whatever it is, some high number, that's great, that proves it. Except you have to really these are longer term strategies usually, but also you only like you said, you only get out what you put in. And so, 100 tiny experiments, you'll see 100 tiny results.
Yeah.
So how do you sort that out? I mean, Joe, Reddit is full of a million places, right? And your job is to direct people to those places. But how often do you see them trying to find their own way in and say we've tried posting in 10 different forums, none of them work?
That is the story that we hear in just about every brand meeting or agency meeting. And it is that brands have not found success on Reddit is, I think, a mistake on our part. We are what feels like an 11-year-old startup. We have an advertising platform that we are investing lots of engineering resources in now. And as of about a year and a half, 2 years ago, we're taking that business seriously. But for so long, advertisers had two options. They could deal with our very rudimentary self-serve platform and try to figure out advertising with no team to support them, or they could go try to build their own communities. I don't know how many Redditors in the room, but if you try to enter organic space, especially on Reddit, without an awareness for what people are looking for there, or why they subscribe to certain communities, or how their feed is set up, you're kind of setting yourself up for failure. And I think there's some interesting conversation here that we're having about where does our fan community live? Having worked on some brands that are not ones that you want to talk about on Facebook, like pest control brands, or I don't want to tell my whole Facebook community that I have cockroach problems by subscribing to a Facebook page that is a bug repeller. That gives me away. And so when we're thinking about where a relevant space is to build that community, I think it's super important that we think about how comfortable are people evangelizing our product, and in a given network, how closely tied to their offline selves are they? With Facebook, you are only connected to those real life friends that you have, and so you're really putting on kind of a, it's an ego space. Like you're kind of positioning yourself socially. And I think the same rules kind of apply for like a Twitter or Instagram, where you might have those same connections that you do on Facebook, but you kind of put on this idealized self that you can kind of go out to those masses of users that you don't know through like hashtags. Reddit is that space that is totally void of that offline connection, and so you're free to express yourself and to join communities that you wouldn't otherwise.
Yeah, the act of public demonstration, is I think this is one thing for me. Like when you look at platforms, what we discovered. I had ended up heading up the editorial and curation team at Medium, and we were looking a lot at what reading patterns happen. The most successful things were the things that people, there was often friction between things that people spent a lot of time with and things that they wanted to promote to the rest of the world. It's like, hey, I'm reading these stories on divorce, probably don't want the rest of my network to know. So So there's a kind of friction between those things, and when those things merge, great things happen. And otherwise, it's like trying to work out how you manage to get distribution or success out of a thing that people want to keep to themselves in a way. So that's a much more closer relationship with a potential customer or a reader or a consumer, right? Rather than their network. So how do you think about customers or networks of customers? We heard some stuff earlier about like nodes, supernodes. Look for the supernodes. Do you look for supernodes?
I think the things that we are more interested in is right now thinking about individual people. I mean, I think the advice earlier for supernodes was like, find this supernode and they will like take your content and put it out into the world, which I think can sometimes happen, but like there's an interesting thing there about like what causes that to happen, right? It's not because like you found this magical like link sharing portal of the universe and like just dropped your thing in there and stuff happened. It was because something that you wrote resonated and something that you wrote had like truth and realness to it, and like people felt that was worth them investing their own social capital to promote, right? I think it's a very big thing to ask people to take things you are writing and put it in front of their community. Like if you think about it, that's a lot to ask of people. And I think that goes back to like the thing that you're writing and the thing that you're saying. But I think, in some capacities, to bring this back to Slack, I imagine many of you use Slack, and if you don't remember back to the very early days when you got on it, and this is probably not totally true for this audience because many of you are marketing developer tools products, so chat has been around much longer in the context of chat ops and how developers work. But for many people working today in the world, Slack is a very different concept of communicating with people and actually getting work done. And it actually requires really significant behavioral change for a lot of people to use, right? So when we think about, I think, content and we think about people that we're marketing to, we're thinking about that person who is coming to Slack and trying to figure out, how does this become my place of work, and how do I really use this to like do the things and communicate with people without looking like an idiot in front of my entire company, in front of a very public forum. So I think going back to very early content for us, we're sort of starting to think about like, how do we help just people think about work in slightly different ways, right? How do we expand their imagination of what it means to be a working person or what it means to get work done at the very, very top end? And I think that then threads itself down to how do we take them from that very initial seed of like, work could be slightly different, to like, here's how I think about actually applying that and using it and being successful in this capacity. So I don't know if that totally answered your question, but I think that individual journey is really important to us. Our marketing strategy is definitely not built around like drop some links into the world, into the right networks, and like and try to like get that virality. It's more about like writing truthful, great things that we feel like are authentically us, and that connecting with an individual person because it does.
So I don't disbelieve that at all. I do a lot of long form work, a lot of my last big project took 18 months of investigative reporting. It was I'm a believer in the long game, but also it's helpful when you have a company that's capitalized to I don't know what Slack's at, like $500 million, something like that. That's kind of useful, right?
I guess. You
can play a long game that way. But not everyone in the room has access to that money. If you do, we can have a chat afterwards. But different people will have different timescales for the results they need. And John, you talked a little earlier about you need to generate leads. But I know Intercom also has founder buy-in to the idea of a long-term content play, right? That's why you're there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think by the time I come, they'd proven that like content could be really, really successful. And I think how they did that early on were like really, really big believers in jobs to be done theory rather than persona. So we think about what is the job that people are trying to do. What are they hiring our product to do? It's Clay Christensen. I'm sure most people have heard about it, at least in passing.
Super great.
And yeah, it informs everything we do, including even the way we market. So that really, informed what we wrote about and what kind of things would go out. But yeah, Des, our co-founder, Des Traynor, like was literally writing one post a week to make sure that there was an email, an RSS feed was being turned into like an email that went out to subscribers. So like I remember what I joined the company, the last meeting I had for him before I joined, he was like, I can't wait for you to start, man, because I have to go back to the office and have an article written by 5:30 today or that email is going out empty. And so you need that kind of discipline and that kind of like consistency. I think, you know, I see a lot of people early stage start off and, you know, they get really enthusiastic about it and they say we're going to blog like 3 times a week, and they last like a month. Like, so you've written what, 12 articles. What if you'd written 1 article a week for 12 weeks? You generate a much bigger audience. So that's a big mistake I see people make because they're saying we don't have time. They, you know, actually go too quickly.
I've seen it. I've done it.
Yeah.
Hundreds of times. You know, you plan for something, but also it's like impact is super important, right? It's like having the right impact at the right time or in the right way is way more valuable than pushing a whole ton of shit out.
But if you even think as well, if you spread it out like week by week, you know, how many good ideas do you have a week? If you're trying to publish 3 blog posts or podcasts or whatever medium you decide to go out in these days, you can't do that 3 times a week. But
I'm a journalist. I've never had a good idea
exactly.
in my life.
Well, other people have good ideas that we acquire.
All right, so engagement. I think I kind of want to slightly ignore the idea of engagement and think about what's engaging, you know, and be a bit more human about it. But metrics are always important in some ways. One of the interesting things, I think everyone has totally different ways of thinking about metrics and what are important to them. And also, everyone's trying to sell you a different metric. So, you know, you go and talk to a platform, you go and talk to Reddit, and there's, you know, here's our metric. Medium, we were like, okay, here's the metric. We measure things by, when you're marketing, that you have totally different metrics. And like, there's some magic that never happens that's meant to bring those 2 things together. But I just wondered, like, how do you measure success? Like, is it fuzzy? Is it hard? What combination of things do you put together in which circumstances? Yeah,
I think for us, we think about 2 different types of metrics. So I think our platform blog is a really great example. So, you know, we're looking at metrics that are trying to tell us if the content actually matters and if it resonates with people. So, you know, if we write something and put it out into the world, what happens as a result? But we don't goal against that, right? The goal isn't like 500 faves of this tweet or, you know, readership of this post in like X percentage. It's like we keep our finger on that pulse because it's helpful for us to know if those things are actually like, I don't know, in some way like engaging with the people that we want. But the stuff that we actually goal against is like how many active developers are building on top of our platform, right? And I think it's very much of that like putting content out in the world and keeping your finger on that pulse, but you want to measure what people do next, and you want to be accountable and goaling against the like actual end state that you're trying to achieve. Yeah, so there's a lot of sort of directionality in there. Yeah. I mean, I don't remember who said this to me, but it's an interesting distinction of like outputs and outcomes. So if you are putting a content strategy out into the world, there are going to be outputs of that, right? And outputs, I think, are like people reading, people sharing, people spending time with the content, but those aren't the outcomes. The outcomes are people doing the end thing that you want with your product. And I think sometimes where I see people make a mistake is they conflate the 2 of those, and engagement becomes this epic distraction of like, how do we growth hack this particular post for like extreme virality, which really isn't the point, right? The point is, like you said, like getting people to use the thing that you are building to use your product. So like goal against that and be accountable to that. Like
at an early stage, the people who find your content at an early stage, you don't need to market to them. Yeah. They're gonna be, you know, just talk to them authentically because they're gonna spread the word. That's what worked for Intercom. If we had tried to market to them at that point, like being really like pushy marketing, they would have like ran a mile. And you don't need to. Like, it's actually counterproductive. So yeah, I think it's really important that you don't try and like look for these engagement metrics and things very early on, or leads or any of that stuff early on. Over time, all that changes, though. I mean, you know, we've got a team producing content now, not just one person who does it, you know, at part time. So you've got to obviously have metrics and goals, and you know, make sure that you're heading in the right direction. I mean, I just mentioned one that we do actually, which is we look at when the content that's working, when was it produced? Because we have this evergreen strategy, so it's like, are we still producing new things that readers are engaged with, because
Yeah.
it's very easy to go off path very, very quickly. I think as you get a bit of success and as you start to like go, wow, people are reading this stuff or listening to this stuff.
Yeah, we're getting on with time. I really want to dig into the Evergreen thing actually a little bit more, but I want to give Joe you the chance to answer the question from your side, which is really, how do you balance what people say they want with what you want to give them?
Interesting. That's an interesting juxtaposition. I mean, I think there's something to be said. I didn't think that I would be the only panelist who thought engagement rate was important. But there's a point there, right? Like that. One of my colleagues used to say in big brand meetings where there is this kind of inclination to maintain brand first and engagement second, and then there are marketers who want to go the opposite direction. If you optimize too much towards engagement, your content strategy will always end up at cats and porn, because that's what the internet loves the most, and nobody wants to get there. So, we've talked about, you mentioned a couple of down funnel metrics. Are people doing what you want them to do? Are they building on your platform? Are they converting to whatever conversion means for you? And I think one of the lessons that I think is really important from the big brand world, and that probably a lot of mid to small sized marketers aren't feeling now, but with success will, are the upper funnel. What does the content you're putting out there say about you? So it's easy. Like Reddit is a place where contrarian content does super well. And if you were a brand who really wanted to optimize a content strategy to do well on Reddit, you might put out 20 really negative sounding like data points. You might work with Rohan and do some cool Priceonomics stuff. But there's a really important message to be taken of, what is being communicated about your brand by your name being behind the writing of this article. And so we use, the old school media measurement of Millward Brown studies still play a major part in what we think of as really important, like full scale measurement of what is successful in terms of advertising to these communities who are totally leaned into the brand's kind of subject area.
Yeah, and that segues nicely into a question about sort of evergreenness versus timeliness. It's sure you could get attention by being timely, but also are you really providing your user or reader or customer with some long-term benefit? But also, I've also seen people go totally the other way, where all they produce is kind of evergreen content, and then they wonder why nobody's interested in it right now. So how do you all balance that? And you can answer this with some alacrity. That would be great.
Well, we go all in on Evergreen. I mean, we so far anyway. That's something we're certainly toying with doing some more timely stuff at the moment. But yeah, I mean, it's just for the investment of your time, and particularly as we grew out content, it just just made a hell of a lot more sense of like having worked in media. Like nobody looks at news the day after. Like literally, you start. And it was, you probably remember, it was going to be one of the business models that was going to save journalism. I can't remember which version we're talking about, but it was like that, all this archive content that like the New York Times and the Irish Times, where I worked, and the Guardian, where Bobbie worked, people would pay for access to this because it was so valuable, all this reporting that had gone. No one visits that shit. No one. Like academic researchers maybe. So if you do
the
news,
long tail is
you get
you
get a really high spike, and then it just drops off. If you do Evergreen, it like starts off there, but then it goes down. The half-life is way, way longer. So like we're all in on it. I mean, I think unless you're building a media organization, unless like Slack with I can't remember how much money he claimed you had, but unless you're building a major media organization, I think it's a really tough one to do. I mean, you can do occasionally. You can certainly do, as Rowan was saying, you can do things that like are. Tap into current trends, or if there's a big news story, absolutely you can try and get some traffic from that. But if that's all you're doing, you're constantly starting every day from zero.
Okay.
It's funny. It reminds me of, we have a community on Reddit called Mildly Infuriating, which is stuff that doesn't make you really mad, but a little mad, just mad enough to post about it. And there was a post recently specifically about lots of news organizations are removing timestamps from their articles. And so I think it totally depends on the type of content that we're putting out, right? If there is a whole culture on Reddit around reposts and content that makes the front page every month, and it gets annoying for those of us who are really nerdy, deep Redditors who see it all the time, but there is always that content that will be evergreen. I don't want to go get enraged about some crisis somewhere that I've just read about, posted on my social network, and then find out that happened 10 years ago and it's not relevant anymore.
How do you this is it, and then we'll
so I will say this quickly. I think that we at Slack obviously take more of an evergreen strategy as well, but I think there's a very important subtlety of that, right? Which evergreen content strategy is not if you build it, they will come and perpetually come forever and ever. So if you're going to take the time to invest in that writing style, you're also going to have to figure out how to invest in repackaging that content and redistributing that content when it makes sense over and over again. So, I think can be one of those great things for you, depending on what you're doing, but it takes a lot of work. It's not just this super simple thing where the pieces sell themselves forever.
Yeah, I always thought about news is about it's new to you. It doesn't matter if it's sometimes it's new to the world, but if it's new to you, and that requires distribution and attacking it at the right moment.
Yeah, and you need to intentionally take those older pieces and figure out what are you going to do with them now. I mean, I don't know if you all are taking this approach, but I think it's very much our thinking, right? Just because some evergreen piece of content is on page 18 of our paginated Medium blog, it's not that
Turns out it
relevant, right? So you've got to dig that stuff out of the archives, and there are lots of different ways you can repackage and reuse that. Maybe you take some version of it and you send it to current customers, or if you are building a sales team, some of that stuff can be really helpful for them. So it has a wide applicability of uses, but you have to actually do the work of making it do work for you.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.